And we had a unique program that I think we will never see again from the federal government, which enabled people to actually earn their living doing jobs for which they were trained, including art. Now, why am I interested in this? I wasn't even born then, but when I was a kid, oops, I think I have to do it here. I grew up in Richmond Hill in Queens, and my local library had a WPA mural, and this is it. It was by Philip Evergood. It's supposedly an allegorical depiction of the development of the community. And it was done, as you can see from the plaque, under the auspices of the Federal Art Project, which was a division of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Now, this mural was a bone of contention among us young aspiring artists. We would argue endlessly about its imagery and the style in which it was painted, or was it any good? What did it represent? And so it just intrigued me that this federal program had created this, or had it created for our local library. And here's the artist who created it, named Philip Evergood. And here he is standing with the mural around the time it was finished. And as you'll notice, see, here's Philip right here. And over here, his self-portrait as a struggling immigrant with his bundle under his arm, wiping cinders from his eyes from the dust and dirt of the city. You can see the 14th Street bus is passing in the background. And the L would take you out to the suburbs of Queens, where you could live comfortably and enjoy the fruits of country living. And as you can see, everyone's dancing around happily. Everyone looks well fed and very light compared to the darkness of the New York City scene on the right. Well, Evergood was, he was alive when I started studying these murals, and I called him up. He lived in Connecticut. And I asked him for information about them, about the mural, and about his work on the WPA, and he was extremely encouraging. This is back in the early 1970s, when very few people cared about this stuff. There was very, very little interest, if any, in the scholarly community. But there were two people who actually were experts on it, and I was fortunate enough to connect with both of them. Francis O'Connor, who is the premier, well, he's deceased now, but he was the premier Pollock scholar. And he came to the WPA through his study of Pollock, because Pollock and most of the artists of that generation were employed on the WPA. I got in touch with Francis and I said, Philip Evergood has encouraged me and I would like to study this. And he said, well, I'm not teaching anymore, but if you want to go to Cleveland, Ohio, to Case Western Reserve University, you can study with Carol Ann Marling, who is doing a big project on federal art in Cleveland. So that's what I did. I went and got my master's degree with Carol Ann Marling, and I had a wonderful experience, a great opportunity to put together an enormous exhibition of federal art that was created in the Cleveland area. It was held at the Cleveland Public Library in 1975, and it was just a wonderful experience to physically get a hands-on working experience of organizing an exhibition. And it actually set me on the path to doing curatorial work and museum work as my primary profession. But also back in those days, the artists like Evergood, many of them were still alive. So one could actually talk to them about their experiences. And many of my art school teachers had been on the WPA, and they also gave me a lot of background information. So I really had the advantage of firsthand testimony from the people who were involved. And that, of course, is no longer possible because we're talking about nearly 60 years ago, and everyone who was involved is now dead. Just to give you a little background on how dire the situation was back in those days, the Depression was brought on by the Wall Street crash in October of 1929. And although there were many other extenuating circumstances that led to the economic downturn, The crash, of course, is the most notable benchmark. And very quickly, the economy went into a tailspin. And by the spring or early January 1930, millions and millions of people were out of work. And they were not looking for a handout. They were looking for work. As you can see from this picketing group in St. Louis, they were saying, you know, we want work. We don't want a handout. We are willing to work, but just give us a job. And there weren't any. By the next year, things had gotten even worse. There were bread lines and soup kitchens. People, as you can see from the caption, there were over 25% unemployment. That means a quarter of the workforce was idle. So the government really needed to do something. Now, during the Hoover administration, there were kind of failed efforts. And by 1932, when the presidential election came along, Hoover was kicked out and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected. Now, Roosevelt had a lot of other things on his plate rather than just thinking about the arts. However, his school buddy, George Biddle, who was an artist, he was a scion of the Philadelphia banking family who went over to the dark side and became a painter. And he had gone to school with Roosevelt. They went to Groton and also to Harvard together. And Biddle was a friend of Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist. And he thought that, as you can see from the quote, that if the government would hire artists at, as he put it, plumber's wages, in other words, a working man's salary or wage, that the artists could somehow promote the New Deal through this kind of visual art that would extol the virtues of what the Roosevelt administration was trying to accomplish. A vital national expression, as he put it. So I think that we have George Biddle to thank for sparking the idea. Not that there weren't other people who had already tried to do some relief work with the artists, especially in New York City. In fact, the College Art Association was very involved in an early effort, but obviously the seeds were being sown, and Biddle was the one who really set it off. In the end, they wound up with 5 projects that were designed specifically to put artists back to work. The first of them, the Public Works of Art project, was really a pilot project designed to just see if it was feasible. It only ran for about 6 months, but it produced 89 murals and various other works of art, employed a number of artists, primarily on the East Coast, but around the country. And once that was finished, it was decided to create 2 parallel projects for different reasons. One of the problems with the PWAP, as it was known, was that there was no control over quality. The artists were hired because they were out of work, but there wasn't the kind of administrative oversight for permanent works in federal buildings or any kind of public building that would ensure what the bureaucrats wanted to consider high quality work. That was the purview of the Treasury Department, which was the procurement agency for art in federal buildings and had been for many, many years. So the Treasury section of painting and sculpture was created essentially as a commissioning agency. So the artists were required to submit material for approval. It was a competitive process. And then the artists were actually commissioned to create their work, primarily in federal buildings. The parallel project, the Works Progress Administration, that started in August of 1935, and that was a work relief program. So in order to qualify, the artist had to be on relief, or as we would say now, on the dole, and also have a professional background. So they didn't just get employed because they had no job, but they also had to be professionals. They had to submit a portfolio and show that they were actually practicing artists. Then there was a kind of hybrid project called the Treasury Relief Art Project, which was short-lived, but it had master artists who were employed by the Treasury, and then assistants who were came from the relief rolls. So that was started in July of 1935 under the auspices of the Treasury Department. And then the Resettlement Administration, which was building housing, also had what they called the Special Skills Division, which employed artists to decorate some of the housing projects and other buildings that were being created under their auspices. And here are some of the administrators. Edward Bruce, who was himself an artist with Eleanor Roosevelt and a couple of the other administrators, looking at the organizational chart for that pilot project. As you can see, if you can just see that it's actually a map of the United States with the different districts marked out. So one of the most interesting and most controversial projects under the PWAP was the decoration of the Coit Memorial Tower. This was a monument to the city's firefighters that had been built in the late 1920s. And it had all these blank walls, and the artists were hired to decorate them with scenes of California life. So, of course, California being the land of plenty, at the top you can see a mural by a female artist, Maxine Albro, called California's Abundance. You have harvesting lilies and oranges and all kinds of fruit and things going on in the background on these prosperous farms, which of course is a big contrast with the Dust Bowl, but California was the land of promise. And of course, that's where many of the people who lost their homes in the Depression tried to go to get work. But down at the bottom, you have a panel. These are true frescoes, by the way. They were actually painted into the wall on wet plaster with pigment that would actually fuse to the wall. So they're a permanent part of the building. And the mural by Victor Arnautoff called City Life, if you can take a look, this is not exactly the most salubrious place to live. If you look over here, there's a man being mugged. See the gun, and someone's picking his pocket. And back here, there's an automobile accident where someone's been struck by a car. So it's like, the city life is a little bit challenging here. And this was not the only controversial imagery. Several of the artists put in images of striking laborers and communist symbols and a library with books by Marx and Engels on the wall. And the whole project was shut down for a number of weeks while some of these images were expunged. But the murals are still there. They were relatively recently restored and look great. So if you happen to be in San Francisco, you can go and have a look at them. And this is one of the very earliest of these federal programs. So because of the quality control issue, committees were set up to vet various mural projects. This is for federal buildings, particularly post offices and federal courthouses. So here you see a jury looking at some sketches that have been submitted, all kinds of wholesome imagery. I think we see a cattle farm and a horse farm. So what they tried to do with these regional commissions for different post offices and courthouses around the country was to get subject matter that related to the community. So they would put out the call for the artist would submit, the various artists would submit work. And many artists from New York, for example, would go out to the Midwest or the South and paint because they won the commission. They were not local people, but they were doing, by and large, local subject matter. And here's one of them, Ben Shahn, a well-known social realist who did one in the Woodhaven Post Office, which was not very far from where I grew up. And this is based the four freedoms. You see the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And so this is the First Amendment. You also have the right to petition the government, and of course, voting. So these kinds of images were very appropriate, not specifically related to the New Deal, but related to the government's protection of individual rights. But the most far-reaching, the most influential, and the most highly regarded today was the WPA Federal Art Project. As I mentioned, it started in August of 1935, and it's often confused. Well, very often New Deal art in general is lumped under the rubric of WPA. But as I said, the Treasury section ran a program, the Resettlement Administration ran a program. So not all of the New Deal murals or New Deal art was done under the WPA, but it certainly did the most. And it was always trying to convince the Congress, which appropriated the funds, that this was a worthwhile enterprise. Hence these two publications and many other things that they did as a kind of lobbying effort to promote what they were accomplishing. This is a chart they created about a year after the project was started. And as you can see, it employed over 5,200 artists just in its first year. Most of them, the bulk of them, were working on murals. As you can see, 955 people were employed on murals because they didn't just use the artists, but they had assistants who would prepare the walls, who would build the scaffolds, who would mix the paints. So it wasn't only the artists. And of course, if it was a very large mural, you would have several artists working on it at once. Also, you can see a lot of easel painters were at work, and graphic artists as well, plus all of the support staff. So, and they set up art centers and galleries across the country. They even employed, as you can see, the artist models. So this was a very, very effective program. It gave people gainful employment, doing work for which they were trained and which was considered a public service. And the artists, by and large, bought into the program philosophically. They thought of themselves as workers performing a service. And although obviously they wanted to express themselves in their work, they felt that it was going for a higher purpose. And rather than going into a private collection or a museum, it would be out there in the public for the people. So this was a very strong motivation for many of the artists. And here's an early version of one of their mural workshops. Very often, rather than working in the building itself, which was not necessarily convenient, for example, this workshop is producing mural panels for a children's hospital. So working in the ward would probably not be advisable. So the artists here are doing their panels in a communal studio, they would then be installed. You have someone sketching from a model. And also you notice that there are 2 female and 2 male artists. So this is very indicative because approximately half of the artists who were employed were women. There was no wage discrimination. Many of the female artists that I know who worked on the project told me that it was such a joy because you got the same pay for the same work. There was no sex discrimination. So this was considered the golden age for many of these women who, after the war and when the gallery system kicked in, were basically kicked out. Also, the WPA tolerated a wide variety of styles. Now, for the Treasury Department, they wanted American scene imagery. They wanted community relatable imagery. But for the easel project, for the people working on canvas or making drawings or prints, there was much more latitude. And this just shows you a couple of examples from a much larger collection that's in the Illinois State Museum that because it's a public institution, these works were allocated to it as the project was being wrapped up. But it shows you we have a hyper realistic painting on the one hand and a very abstract one on the other. So this kind of latitude was allowed under the WPA, but it would not have been allowed in the Treasury Department. A couple of examples closer to home. We have Lee Krasner's sketch for a mural at WNYC, which was in the municipal building in New York City. The station has moved, and in fact, she never got to paint the mural because by 1941, the project was winding down, and the mural that she proposed never happened. Although there were murals by Stuart Davis and several other artists in the building. The Jackson Pollock mosaic was intended to be installed in a wall in a building. It's actually about 5 feet tall, but for some reason it was not allocated. It never found a home in a public building. He took it home with him, and it is in fact still in his estate. Some of the other, in addition to commissioning artists or paying artists to do their work, the WPA set up a variety of workshops. You saw the Moses Sawyer picture of the communal mural workshop. There were also sculpture workshops. You see one there on the upper left. They did exhibitions. They had a WPA gallery in New York City and also did outdoor exhibitions. They set up community art centers where they had classes, and you see one on the lower right. And then also they had a poster project, and these posters are now highly collectible, but they had posters that were done for all the various activities that they did. The National Youth Administration posters are what you're looking at in that photograph. Now, I mentioned that they did not only employ artists, they also employed their assistants. And in the upper left, you see an artist named Grace Greenwood working with her assistant, who was a man, on a mural for a housing project. And on the right, her sister, Marion Greenwood, is demonstrating fresco technique. Both she and her sister studied in Mexico with Diego Rivera, and she is showing a group how to make a true fresco on a plaster panel. Down below, you see Conchetta Scaravaglione doing a sculpture. And on the left is a female artist working on the Index of American Design. This was kind of a sub-project where artists were made renderings of American design elements, such as this wind vane. And it's a very extensive collection. Illustrators and watercolorists were employed to do this, and it's in the Library of Congress. Oh, where's my mouse? There it is. Well, as you can imagine, Congress got a little tired of spending money on art, and they decided to, quote unquote, investigate the projects. What they were really looking for was a way to cut the projects altogether, and their excuse was that it was a hotbed of radicalism. All the left-wingers were on it, and of course it was true that many of the artists who were employed by it were very left-wing, but of course many of the Republicans in Congress considered the New Deal to be a socialist program, and so they were looking for ways to get rid of as much of it as possible. And in 1939, the Congressional Committee was set up to basically try to slash it as much as possible. There were hearings were held, and artists started getting pink slips. Now, this is an earlier version. That is actually a self-portrait by Philip Evergood, showing him receiving a pink slip. And the reason it happened so early was because there was an 18-month rule. If you were employed for more than 18 months, or for 18 months, they would kick you off, and then you had to reapply. Meanwhile, some people might have gotten a job, but most of the artists, of course, were unemployable. So they would reapply and get back on. But the pink slip was a dreaded thing that would come in the mail, and then you had to start the process over again. So although this was a godsend for so many artists, it was absolutely not a walk in the park. There was a lot of bureaucracy involved, and many of the artists were terminated and then reapplied. Maybe they'd get back on, maybe not. Pollock was on and off a number of times, and so was Lee. So, of course, they protested. They had sit-down strikes. They had picket lines. They were very vocal about their desire to have the project not only continue, but expand, whereas Congress was going in the opposite direction and trying to cut them. And here are a couple more examples of cartoons that were done at the time, showing how the fat cats and the bureaucrats were trying to eliminate these projects. And of course, by the time the war rolled around, 1941, we entered World War II. The WPA became a war services program that produced material for the war effort. And by 1943, it was wound up entirely, or as they put it at the time, it was given its honorable discharge. But it left behind a huge legacy of public art. It also left behind artists who were able to make it through the Depression without having to give up their profession, and who went on, like Pollock and Krasner, to become world renowned. I mean, we're talking about people like Willem de Kooning, Arshel Gorky, Mark Rothko, Adolf Gottlieb, Franz Klein. I could go on, but I won't. What I'm going to do instead is show you some examples of New Deal art close to home. I mentioned the Treasury Relief Art Project. Well, William Gropper, who was the author of one of those cartoons, did a pair of murals in the Freeport Post Office on Long Island that were done under the Treasury Relief Project. And I particularly like the Suburban Post in winter. It's got a wonderful dynamic composition with these zigzags across the whole field, looking out over the suburbs. And that mural is very much still there. Whereas some of them have disappeared because buildings have changed hands, or they have just gone out of circulation. This is a much different program in the Oyster Bay Post Office, where the architecture is very different, and also the whole theme is different, much more allegorical, although there are some figurative elements that are more naturalistic, such as right here's a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. You have George Washington up here. So these are historical murals. The ceiling, very Renaissance kind of imagery, is supposed to be America welcoming mail from all over the world. And the over door panels by Leo Lentelli show Africa and Oceania. And then on the opposite wall are two other continents. So this is a very, very different approach. But you can see that there was a wide stylistic variety. And also a very kind of innocuous scene of outdoor sports in the West Hampton Beach Post Office. And some panels in schools as well. In fact, my school, Richmond Hill High School, we didn't have a mural, but we had some carvings over the library door that were done under the PWAP. And this mural, and there's another matching one on the opposite wall by Joseph Allen Physiak, shows local farming. And a couple of historical panels. I apologize for the quality of these slides. I got them off the internet, so they're a little bit fuzzy, but Robert Gaston Herbert did for the Suffolk Infirmary 2 panels reflecting Long Island history. The Native American preacher, Paul Cuffey, who was converted to Christianity, is shown preaching to the Indians, and the famous Bull Smith, riding his bull as far as he could in one day, gave him the claim to the property that he covered in that one day. So these are 2 historical scenes, and they're now in the infirmary is now a Suffolk County office building. The largest WPA mural in the country is right here on Long Island. It's in Queens at the Marine Air Terminal of LaGuardia Airport. Again, this is not a terribly good slide, but you can get the picture. It was done by James Brooks, who went on to become a very notable abstract expressionist. But at the time, he was tinkering with abstraction. You can see that there are abstract elements, for example, over here, and the way this composition, this is a Leonardo da Vinci invention, kind of potpourri, the Wright brothers. So these are all flight-related images, but some of them are quite abstract. This is an aerodynamic airfoil abstraction. But this airport is where the seaplanes came in. So here you have a seaplane, And on the opposite wall, you really have the history of flight from very, very early musings of primitive people sitting around a campfire, looking up into the sky, looking at the birds and wishing that they could fly, to modern flight, where you have a man and a woman here planning, working on plans and drawings for flying machines. So this kind of topical imagery in a very appropriate location was very, very typical of the sort of thing that the WPA was doing. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, this mural was completely painted over. We don't know exactly why, but there are a couple of theories, one of which is that because the WPA was considered a socialist program, during the Cold War and the McCarthy era, it was decided that this was subversive, so it was just painted over. Or it simply could have been a redecoration program where they decided they didn't want pictures on the wall. But in the early 1980s, it was restored. Fortunately, it was painted with an experimental paint called Glyptol that did not bond with the paint that was painted over it, which was just commercial house paint. So the solvent that was used for the commercial house paint did not affect the Glyptol paint. And the mural was beautifully restored. And I highly recommend a trip to the wonderful Marine Air Terminal. As you can see, it's a rotunda. And just go in there, park your car, go in and take a look, because this will knock your socks off. So anyone who's interested in pursuing more information about the New Deal in all of its aspects, because there are many, many other things, the wonderful work they did in the parks, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a training program for young people, the National Youth Administration, many, many other things that they contributed to that are still being used by people today. The post offices, the courthouses, the swimming pools, the hospitals, all the things that were built are still, many of them are still there. And if you go to the Living New Deal's website, you can get much more information about them. And also another site, the National New Deal Preservation Association, a group that works to make people aware of what is surviving and what needs to be done to protect and preserve it. So I thank you so much for your patience, for being just a wonderful audience. And please, if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, anyone who wishes to ask questions, put them in the chat room and I'll read them out. So we'll give you a minute.
Or just unmute yourselves and I'd be happy.
You can unmute. Yes, it's true. You could unmute if you wish to unmute and just ask the question straight to Helen. Please feel free. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Have you? So Kim Bernhardt wants to say, this was well worth the wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate that.
It was indeed. It's a fascinating subject. It really was interesting.
Well, I do recommend that people seek these things out, because I think a lot of times people walk past them without realizing what they are and without understanding what an important legacy it is, because without the government support, as I said, the artists really would not have been able to continue working during the Depression without giving up their art and having to go to do something else. So when I was in art school and when I was in college, my teachers would, in fact, I went to the Brooklyn Museum Art School, and the guy who ran it had been a WPA artist. And he just said, you have no idea, you're going to have to go out into the world and get a gallery and get a representative and have collectors buy your work and have museums show it and have galleries show it and have people write about it. We didn't have to think about any of that. We just picked up our paycheck and did our work. And it was another world. So although, one would hardly wish for another Depression, one would certainly wish for another WPA.
Yeah, Kellen Alder says, I agree, well worth the wait, important part of our history, and which I definitely agree with. I think it's amazing that happened. because it's very rare that artists get a break.
Right. Well, no, although, as I say, they had to put up with some nonsense, but particularly they had timekeepers who would come and make sure that they were turning in their work on time. And, you know, artists don't necessarily work to the clock. They're not usually on deadline. So that could be a bit onerous. And I've even been told by one artist that they checked if you had a refrigerator because that was a luxury. And that was considered, you know, you were making too much money if you could afford a refrigerator.
That's so funny. Does anyone else have any questions?
I do have a question. I'm Ken Ratner. First of all, Helen, thank you so much. It was well worth the wait. It was extraordinarily interesting, and thank you. So,
Thank you, Ken.
my question is, at some of the artists were mentioning Philip Evergood, I think in the 1970s. I know now there's great interest in the WPA, and there have been museum exhibits of artists of the Works Project Administration. Hopefully, did some of the artists live long enough? I know Moses, Raphael Sawyer lived, especially Raphael Sawyer lived a long life, but did some of these artists, were they rewarded emotionally in seeing exhibits come to fruition of the works from WPA, and how that must have been so satisfying to them?
Well, in the 1970s, I think it was 1976 for the centenary, bicentenary, I beg your pardon, a group of WPA artists got together and did a big exhibition in New York City. And many of the alumni got together at that point. But I do have to say, when I was doing my research in the early 70s, some of the artists really didn't want to be reminded that they'd been on relief and that they'd been supported by the government and that they'd been involved in some of these more or less left-wing organizations like the Artists Union and the Unemployed Artists Group, and groups that had, you know, the taint of communism behind them. So, and also, this was history to them. And of course, it was history to me too, but it was not what they were doing then. They wanted people to be more interested in the work they were doing in the 70s rather than what they were doing in the 30s. So I had to be very diplomatic when I interviewed them because I didn't want them to feel that I was only interested in the past. And they were very much alive and very much working, and often in a very different style, like Jim Brooks, if you know his work. He went and became an abstract expressionist, as did Pollock, as did Krasner. And these people weren't necessarily sympathetic to someone who just wanted to talk about the 1930s and what they did on the project. So, but as I say, Evergood, he was one of the presidents of the Artists Union, and he was totally unreconstructed, and he gave me an earful and really encouraged me. So not all of them were that encouraging, but most of the ones that I did, because I was concentrating on mural painting, that was my specialty. So many of them were proud of what they had done and really didn't mind being reminded of what they'd accomplished under the projects.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have a question or a comment? Nobody else?
Well, you've all been very patient, and I really thank you so much for hanging in there, and I hope to see you again.
Well, thank you, Helen. And yeah, I think once it got going, it was well worth it. It was fascinating, and we hope everyone enjoyed it. I just want to give a few little notes on what's coming next. Our next lecture will be in September on the 19th, presented by Thomas Germano, and it'll be, the title is Van Gogh in Auvers-sur-Oise. And our next exhibition will be a solo show featuring the work of renowned pastel artist Lana Ballett. The opening reception for that will be on September 12th. I also urge everyone, if you're interested in classes, please check out our summer offerings. We've got a lot of one-day workshops on offer. All those details can be found on our website. And look out for our emails about our lectures, exhibitions, any other upcoming events, classes, and workshops. And again, thank you, Helen, and good night, everyone.
Good night.